All right. Well, welcome everybody to Uplift tonight. This is becoming more and more fun every time. Just excited to have a few of you with us tonight, and especially special guests, Laura Hales and Steve Harper. Laura is going to kick us off tonight, and she's got a great presentation about LDS podcast that she runs. And I'm just really excited to have her. She's super bright, a powerful voice for faith in our community and outside of our community, and just love her a lot and just appreciate her being here tonight. Laura, I'll go ahead and share your PowerPoint and we can begin.
I started LDS Perspectives about a year and a half ago. We started taping. I had been to Sweden speaking on Joseph Smith's practice of plural marriage, and was approached by some of the people there who mentioned that there was really no way for them to access scholarship that they wanted to, because a lot of it's not available in foreign languages, and they can listen to it, but the only place to listen to theology and doctrine of the Mormon Church by any kind of experts was John DeLynn, which kind of broke my heart. But thinking about it, it was. And once you start distrusting, you don't really want to go to the Mormon channel for that kind of thing. So I set out to do a podcast, and luckily I have a lot of connections with scholars, plus I'm pretty bold. So we premiered last September, and we've had 1.2 million downloads in 165 countries for our first 52 podcasts, which it means that it's catching on. And I think the reason it's catching on is because people want to engage on a deeper level with our doctrine and theology. We want to talk about things that we really can't talk about in gospel doctrine class, just because either it's inappropriate to do it there, or we're ashamed when we bring questions up, or there's just not another contemporary studying the same thing that we study. The reason I usually provide resources is because it's something that I would like myself. So it kind of has to pass that test. So I wrote my first book because there wasn't a book on Joseph Smith's polygamy for the normal mainstream people like me who didn't want to read 1,500 pages on the topic. And then I also helped edit A Reason for Faith that Steve Harper wrote 2 chapters in, because I wanted a resource as a parent to access just short little information bits on major historical and theological issues. And luckily I have access to a great library, but most people don't. So I provided that resource. A couple of years ago, I started listening to the Maxwell Institute, and this was when they just had scholars on who were non-members. And I am so grateful for Blair Hodges, because he introduced me to some great biblical scholars. But even that can affect our faith, because I began to ask myself, are there no LDS scholars that can address these topics? So that was another motivation for this podcast. And the answer is yes, there are LDS scholars that can address these topics. And I know that because as I've studied, I'll come across something and have a question, and I might even have a panic moment, and I'll shoot off an email to a friend I know who is either in church history or in biblical studies, and they'll help me to understand that concept. But not everybody has that kind of resource. So hence the podcast. Now, when I say podcast, some people go, oh, that's just a bunch of people chatting. But I'd like you to kind of consider it like the great courses, because we have a topic, and both the podcaster and the interviewee study a long time and prepare for this podcast. And so we like to say we have the most ideas per minute. If you haven't learned something new in a half an hour to 40 minutes, then we've failed. So we don't do a lot of chit-chatting. We talk systematically from the beginning to the end about a topic. But we can do it and make it so that topics, instead of being taboo, are okay to talk about. My daughter, who became a podcaster, said one of her favorite parts of the podcast is that she feels now like it's okay to ask questions because these great LDS scholars who work at places like BYU or the Church History Library are asking the same questions and discussing the topics. And so there's a demystification there. It's okay to talk about things in a faithful, respectful manner, and we don't have to sensationalize it. If you want to advance the slide, Leo. So you can find us on our website, LDSPerspectivespodcast.com, or iTunes, or your Android apps, or we're even carried on lots of popular LDS websites like Meridian Magazine and LDS Living and The Interpreter and Mormon Hub. We release an episode every week. We're hoping to go every other week at the beginning of the year, but it's been difficult because there are so many academics and scholars who are willing to come on the show and talk to mainstream members. And we want to try to post our podcasts within 4 months of taping them. As a benefit, we also provide transcripts, which we've found get 25% of our downloads. We've already been quoted in published books from those transcripts. So if you'd prefer to read instead of listen, that's an option as well. Plus, the transcripts help if you want to refer to something an academic has said in even a church talk, because we do cover topics like the evolution of the temple endowment, things that would be addressed in a talk. We're excited. The best is to come. If you advance to the last slide, this is just a partial list of the people who appeared on the podcast the first year. And we have many more exciting people lined up for January, February, March as well. So, any questions?
Well, I've got everybody on mute, but if someone has a question, you can put it in the chat. Or if you want to message me in other ways, you can. I think it's a wonderful thing you're doing. And of course, one of the things I like about your approach here, Laura, is when we're busy with, on a commute or, even feeding our kids some dinner, we can turn on the podcast and listen to them. I just think that's a wonderful gift to us, us people here that are just needing help with faith. And so I really appreciate that approach. I think it's wonderful.
Well, it is meant to multitask, but also it's so hard to find a friend who is thinking about the things you're thinking about, studying on the level you're studying with. And this helps you to realize that there's a whole bunch of us out there who'd like to engage more with the issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what would you say, just kind of touch on this briefly, but advice from your past with, you said you've emailed a bunch of people to get help with different issues, that sort of thing, but with those people that are struggling with faith, maybe at the beginning of a faith journey, that faith crisis or faith transition, what kind of advice do you have for them? To listen to the podcast, yes, but any other advice you can give to those people who are struggling with faith?
Oh, I would say don't panic. I can admit that there is an intellectual component to my faith. I need to know intellectually how things fit together sometimes. Not everybody needs that. And if you're one of those people where someone says just have faith and it'll work out and that doesn't make you feel better, you don't have to feel bad about that or that something's wrong with you or your faith is lacking. There are genuine questions out there that haven't been answered from our basic church curriculum because that really isn't the purpose of our curriculum, especially in a worldwide church. So number one is do not panic. Number two is don't stop studying. Don't get in that place of cognitive dissonance where you feel like I need to make this decision right today. I need to have the answer right today. I like to talk to people about other things in our lives that we don't understand, like how those electrons in a television really work. I don't understand it. It'll probably take my whole life, but I also don't lose sleep over it because that TV works for me. And at times I can say that about my religion as well. I don't understand everything, but it's got me to where I am, and it's got me the comfort I needed in the darkest hours of my life. And I can't think of any other place I'd want to be than in a place where I can access that. So, one, don't panic. Two, don't stop studying. And three, seek out people who have the same questions that you do. And I don't mean in a negative, snarky way. You know, it's easy to find complainers. But what I have found when I've interviewed these wonderful scholars is they have just as many questions as anyone I've ever talked to. But instead of being frustrated and walking away, they just dive deeper, and it becomes more interesting. And I admit that the Bible is so much more interesting to me now that my concept of Genesis has been turned upside down. So it doesn't have to necessarily be a negative. I'm a person who loves to learn, and there's definitely plenty of opportunity to learn and say, wow, that's a really interesting nuance. Where can that take us? I recently interviewed Sean Hopkins on a book that's coming out on Abinadi, and I complimented him because in there the scholars really address the intertextuality between the Book of Mormon and the New Testament and the Old Testament, how they overlap. And I was talking to a friend who tends to be on the skeptical side, and I was saying I was so excited they were transparent about this and open, and how that opened new avenues of research. And he's like, wait, you're excited they're transparent? I'm like, yes, this is exciting and this is new. Nothing they're going to find is going to change what happens between me and my maker on a faith level, but it certainly can help me engage in the religion more. And reading that book and their transparency made me want to pick up the Book of Mormon and read it more than going to church and being challenged by my bishop, just because I have that intellectual component to my testimony.
Well, thank you, Laura Hales. That was wonderful. We really appreciate you being here, and we wish you all the best. Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Harper, for being here. Just appreciate you, and we've talked before. Actually came up to Salt Lake to visit with you and ask you for your help. And on a personal note, I just want to tell everyone what a kind soul Dr. Harper is. He is an example of my Savior. He helped me in a time of need with some questions about church history. And I talk about Steve quite often online, and I just really appreciate his research, his love, his compassion, his honesty, and just really appreciate you, Steve, for being here tonight. So thank you so much. And we've actually sent you some questions in advance, and if you want to go through any of those or just give us general advice, we're just happy to have you.
Thank you, Leo. I appreciate your kind words. Admire you very much. I really appreciate what you're doing with this. It's a fulfillment of things you and I have talked about how sometimes we want to say, why doesn't the church do this for us or that? And I think that Elder Oaks a few years ago paraphrased John Kennedy and said, ask not what the church can do for you, but what you can do for the church. And that's what you've done. I appreciate it. I appreciate what Laura said too and what she's doing. It's a really incredible resource that she's providing. I'm thankful to her. She's been very kind to me too, and I'm grateful for that.
So I guess the one that we start off with is important for all of us here and those who are seeing this online. But general advice when it comes to experiencing new information, when you're going through doubts, questions turning into doubts, faith transition or faith crisis. Any thoughts there? With all of your background, all of your study, how did you deal with new information, and any advice for us?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts here. I'll try to be coherent. One thought is to echo exactly what Laura said. That was wise counsel that she gave. Don't panic. There's no need to panic. And I guess my biggest desire is to help people change their expectations of a few things, and also be able to just see things a little differently. I find that most people who feel like they're in a crisis got there because they made some assumptions that were not well founded. And when they discovered information that challenged or overturned their assumptions, they experienced a crisis of faith. So some of the things they thought were true turned out not to be true, and that often has the effect of causing them to question other things. And so if we can figure out what we're assuming, if we can test the things that we believe, the way I ask my students to confront this is to say, what do you know and how do you know it? And I'm talking about ultimate things, not how do you know when your airplane leaves, or how do you know what time your television show comes on. I'm talking about, what do you know about God? What do you know about Christ? What do you know about the Book of Mormon? How do you know it? And if people will think a little more simply and systematically about those basic things, I think a few things generally happen. One is we find that we know a lot less than we might think we do. A lot less. And that's a good thing in my opinion. And we also find that if we don't know how we know something, we may not really know it. So for example, I would say, I know the Book of Mormon is true. I know it by the power of the Holy Ghost. And I would tell an experience I had as a 19-year-old that confirms that for me, together with some ongoing experiences with the Book of Mormon. And that's what I mean by what do you know and how do you know it. But then there's a lot I don't know. There are mountains and mountains of things I do not know. And I think it's wise and protective for us, for our faith, to not have faith in things that aren't sound, aren't proved. As we go down this list of questions, we'll see some assumptions embedded in some of the questions, and we could raise awareness of those assumptions and talk about them. But before that, let me tell you about a formative experience I had when I was 14 that has shaped my response to challenging information ever since. So it was the summer of 1985, and the Church News published a little article that said there's an early letter of Joseph Smith's that's been discovered. It's probably the earliest example of his handwriting. And then it actually published the letter. And the letter was purportedly from Joseph Smith to Josiah Stoll, telling Stoll how to find the right kind of hazel branch and how to cut it, and then how to use it to find buried treasures that were guarded by clever spirits. And I got home from my paper route, sat down to the breakfast table like usual, and sat next to my dad. He had already read the article, and I read it. And I looked at him and I said, "Why are they not teaching me this in church?" And he said, "I really don't understand that. I've never heard that before. It's kind of puzzling to me." And then he said, "I know the Book of Mormon's true. and he told me how he knew it was true, and he helped me understand the implications of knowing the Book of Mormon's true. And then he said something I'll never forget. He said, if you'll wait and keep learning, keep trying to figure this out, you'll see that everything will work out all right. And folks who are listening to this probably know the end of that story already, right? That letter was not written by Joseph Smith. It was written by Mark Hoffman, who that October killed 2 people trying to cover his lies and then nearly killed himself. And as his forgeries and his lies unraveled, that became clear. And in the meantime, a lot of people tried to explain that letter and other documents. A lot of really sophisticated people with a lot of academic credentials tried to explain them in ways that turned out to be a lot less enduring and a lot less satisfying than my father's way. My father didn't pretend to know what he didn't know. He absolutely remained anchored to what he did know. And then he had the patience and the faith to say, if you will keep looking, hang on, you will see that this will all work out. And he was absolutely right. And I'm grateful to have learned that at a young age. I'm not sure I would have pursued the same journey in life, or if I would have remained as firm in the faith, if I hadn't been given that. Epistemology is a fancy word, as you know, for a way of knowing, a philosophy of knowing. If I hadn't been given my dad's way of knowing at that young age and then tested it out for myself over the next decade or so, I'm not sure I would have done as well through the storms. But because I was given that and tested it for myself, know for myself the same things he knew, feel perfectly okay saying there's a lot of stuff I do not know, a lot of stuff that puzzles me, a lot of unanswered questions. Because I've been able to say that, there's nothing that's upset my boat or my faith. I expect controversial and unanswerable questions to come along. I anticipate that they will. They always have. I expect they always will. So one thing I'm pointing out there is expectation management is quite important to how people deal with and get through the challenges of life, challenges to faith.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Other questions that we have here, we could have some of your advice on the First Vision accounts. Would you like to take us through, maybe at a high level, some of your research and maybe some of your answers to some of the criticisms? I know that could be a long conversation, but your book is out there, and maybe you can talk us through that at a high level.
Yeah, thanks. Will you rein me in if I get carried away on this?
Sure. I'll set a timer.
All right. So I'm assuming that folks who are listening know there are several accounts of the First Vision, 4 that come to us from Joseph Smith directly, either through him or his scribes, and at least 5 others by contemporaries of his who heard him tell about it. What they might not know is we now know of evidence that he's telling the vision earlier than we thought. Just a generation ago, the best scholarship said he's really not telling it until the late 1830s, early 1840s. We now know he's telling it by the early to mid 1830s. We also know that it doesn't become a common memory. It doesn't become a collective memory or common knowledge of the Latter-day Saints until late in the 19th century, about 1880, when it's canonized in the Pearl of Great Price. And frankly, it wouldn't have then if Orson Pratt hadn't been pretty dogged in his repetition and rehearsal of Joseph's history. So, as folks probably know, the main criticisms are that because there are these multiple accounts, there's evidence that Joseph Smith is inconsistent. He doesn't tell the same story the same way every time. and that evidence is interpreted by Fawn Brodie to mean that he is making it up. She says it's a half-remembered dream from his youth that he then spins into a story that gives him authority or credibility. She originally thought that happened in 1837-38 with the account that's now in the Pearl of Great Price. But when the other accounts were discovered, she just moved that date forward in time until she got to 1834. But in any case, her interpretation of the evidence was Joseph invented the vision and he embellished it over time. And then in the 1960s, a Presbyterian minister named Wesley Walters dug into the historical setting for the first vision. He limited himself to Palmyra Village, and he discovered that he couldn't discover in the newspapers and some other kinds of records evidence for what he thought was meant by an unusual excitement on the subject of religion. And so he said, you can't disprove that Joseph had a vision, but you can disprove that the context he described for it is historical, and therefore you can impeach the vision. He made two fallacies in his argument. One was an irrelevant proof. That is to say, he sort of proved that there was not evidence for an unusual religious excitement in 1820 in Palmyra Village, but Joseph Smith never said there was. He said that in the 2 years preceding the vision or so, there was unusual religious excitement on the subject of religion in the district of country where he lived. The whole region was affected by it. And of course, Wesley Walters' argument set forth a bunch of researchers to check his research and go beyond it. And what they found when they scoured the whole district of country is plenty of evidence to support Joseph's telling of the story. So an irrelevant proof and a negative proof as well. To say that there's not something, essentially to say there's not evidence of revivalism is in no way proof that there's not a vision in Manchester. No revivalism in Palmyra doesn't mean there's no vision in Manchester. So Wesley Walters was pretty compelling to a lot of people for a while. Reverend Walters was, his arguments, but they really are not very sound anymore. Certainly a lot of evidence that they're not very sound. There's three main critiques. One is Fawn Brodie's, one is Wesley Walters. The other one, frankly, is the original Methodist minister who just rejected it on the grounds that it's impossible. All of those critiques are what a philosopher would call a priori. Right? They're based on assumed common sense, reason, right? These things can't happen. We all know that. But Joseph Smith's rationale is a posteriori. It's based on experience. I had a vision. I knew it. I knew God knew it. I couldn't deny it. It's a different way of coming at the issue. People will arrive at their own conclusions about it based on what they're willing to believe. I'm certainly willing to believe Joseph Smith on that. I find the answer to his prayer to be unbelievably desirable. A God who's not the God of John Calvin and Jonathan Edwards, the angry God, but rather a God who condescends to answer anxious teenagers, the God of James 1 and 5. That's the God I want to believe in and trust and worship and follow. And so the first vision is beautiful to me. It puzzles me that anybody would want to reject it or fight against it. There's nothing in it except loveliness, a loving God. Anyway, we'll go as far as you want with that, but why don't you butt in and reorient me?
That sounds good. Thank you very much. A couple other questions here. One that I know that was important for a friend of mine. Any thoughts about rebaptism?
Yeah, I saw that one. I'm certainly not an expert on that, but there are people who are. The first thing I would do if I wanted to dig into rebaptism is go to library.byu.edu. Or there is a massive database housed at the BYU library site, and it includes all Mormon history-related scholarship. And once you get there, if you plug in the word rebaptism, it will bring up a bibliography of the great things that have been published on it. There are a number of, all the relevant secondary sources are there, and several published primary sources are there as well. And the first place I would go is to Paul Peterson's dissertation. He's the one who dealt with the Mormon Reformation in his dissertation. And then there's an article by Steve Taysom as well that deals with baptism for health. So those are the places I would go for that.
Very good. I'll put the link of that. I'll look for that and put it into the description of the video. So thank you.
Hey, Leo, I don't want anybody to feel like I dodged the question of accounts or the, discrepancies or differences. Do you want to go back to that for a minute?
Sure. Yeah, no, go right ahead. Talk about it as much as you like, please.
So the earliest account comes from 1832. It's an effort on Joseph Smith's part to write autobiography. And it comes from the same context and time as when he starts to write. It's actually in the same book in which he starts to copy letters. And it comes from the exact same time that he starts to keep a daily journal for a week, and then he quits for a year and starts again. And it comes from the same context too, where he starts to record his revelations. So this grows out of the command on the day the church is organized to keep a record, which is repeated with much more force in what's now DNC 85. So you see that Joseph feels this imperative from the Lord to keep records of his sacred experiences. And you also see that he feels inadequate and he doesn't like to do it. He doesn't really want to do it. And every time he starts to do it, you notice that he sort of has a war with himself in the opening passage. I've got to do this, but I didn't get to go to school for very long. It's going to sound bad. He's quite worried that people will find him an inadequate record keeper. It's not unlike Moroni at Ether 12, when he's got to keep the record and he's worried about how inadequate he'll sound, and the Lord reassures him that it doesn't really matter. He can make weak things strong. He can make Moroni's words powerful. And Joseph Smith certainly feels that way when he starts to record his history. So the first one is part of the 6-page autobiography. It focuses very much on what it felt like to be teenage Joseph Smith. He says he's convicted of his sins. He's searching for forgiveness. He is in despair because he can't find any church that matches the New Testament church. I felt to mourn for my sins and for the sins of the world, he says. But he goes to the woods to pray, finally, as a last resort. And the Lord opened the heavens upon me, and I saw the Lord. And he said unto me, Joseph, my son, thy sins are forgiven thee. And it's that passage that many critics will point at and say, he only says that one divine being appears to him in this account. They might be right about that, but I really don't think so. I think it's much more likely that Joseph means God appeared to me and revealed Christ. The Lord opened the heavens upon me, and I saw the Lord. And the reason I interpret both those references to Lord as different divine beings is because in a couple of other accounts, Joseph says one divine being appeared first and revealed the other one. So if we read the 1832 in light of those, then it seems perfectly possible that he was referring to two, and he just called them both Lord. In other words, he's sort of struggling to figure out, how do I tell this story? What words do I use? They defied description. And in the letter he wrote or recorded in the letter book on the pages immediately following this account, he spontaneously prays and says, "O Lord, deliver me from the narrow prison of paper, pen, and ink, and a crooked, broken, scattered, and imperfect language." He just feels woefully inadequate to put into words the sacred experiences he's had. And that's what the evidence shows, right? Anybody who wants to see what the evidence on the page looks like can see those things. But the critics want to bring a set of preconceived expectations. You'll notice that their critiques always start with an if not explicitly, then implied, right? If he has a vision of God in Christ, then he, of course, will tell it immediately. If he had a vision of God in Christ, then, of course, he wouldn't call them both Lord. If this, if that. And this is what I call hypothetical history. You'd get thrown out of graduate school if you did your history degree this way. It's dreadful. It's not looking at the evidence of the witness and letting them tell you what happened, and letting your expectations be shaped by what the evidence says and where it leads. Instead, it's you deciding what the outcome should be and then projecting onto the witness what it is. And when the historical witness doesn't match your expectations, you impeach him. And, that's bad history. I know it seems compelling, but it's really dreadful history. Do you guys know the Seinfeld episode where, I don't know if you guys old enough to know Seinfeld?
Yeah. Yes, of course.
So there's this one, I hope I get the story right, but the dentist converts to Judaism, and Jerry's offended by this and goes to confront the dentist about it, and I'm going to ruin the story, I'm afraid, but essentially what it comes down to is that the dentist converts to Judaism partly so he can tell jokes, jokes on Jews. And so he says, is this to Jerry, does this offend you as a Jewish person? And Jerry says, no, it offends me as a comedian. I hope I got that right. But the point of telling that is, I'm offended sometimes as a Latter-day Saint by the critics, but I'm also offended as a historian, right? Some of the method used by some of the critics is really dreadful. Look at Michael Quinn as a good example. Quinn did this essay, this dialogue, electronic essay a few years ago about the historical setting for the first vision, and says Joseph tells a consistent story with the historical facts. Right, so Quinn is a good researcher, a diligent historian, and he doesn't start out to impeach Joseph. Look at, by comparison, Dan Vogel. Dan Vogel starts out to impeach Joseph. His first premise is what the historian David Hackett Fisher called a declarative question. That is, the question that assumes its own answer. So Dan Vogel does history with the end already written. He knows Joseph Smith doesn't tell the truth, so he's going to tell you what the truth really is. So I want to raise that as a kind of a contrast in styles. Okay, 1835 account. This one is different fundamentally because the 1832 account of the first vision is characterized by what neuroscientists call strategic retrieval of the memory. Now, this is where you sit down intentionally remembering so you can write autobiography or compose history. Strategic retrieval, okay? So when you do that, your brain will actually pull the pieces of the memory together in a different way. You're responding to a different kind of cue. And in 1835, Joseph doesn't sit down to write an autobiography. He's just talking to a guy who's come to quiz him and to essentially to compare prophetic credentials with him. And in the process of this conversation, Joseph tells him about the coming forth of the Book of Mormon. And he says, when he looks for the events that led to that, he starts with the vision. So this is the first time he ever uses the word first to describe the vision. Okay, so, hey Sam, good to see you, brother. So this is a spontaneous retrieval. And when you compose a memory just on the fly, spur of the moment, it will actually come together differently than if you are writing an autobiography. The folks listening and I could test this. They could all try this themselves. And if they did so, they would notice, if they kept a record of themselves doing this over a period of 10 years, they would notice that they tell the formative events of their life differently, depending on how they remember it, what the present circumstances are when they remember it, and they could then understand why there are differences in the first vision accounts. The differences are by no means fatal. They don't impeach Joseph. I think they do make good sense in the context of how he remembered, why he remembered, how the memories were recorded, and how they were transmitted down to us. The next one is the one that's in the Pearl of Great Price, and everybody knows this one pretty well. It's characterized by interpretive memory. So there's factual memory, where you just tell the facts. I went into the woods on a spring morning after having read James 1 and 5. I knelt, I prayed, I was almost overwhelmed. I saw two personages in this pillar. So that's factual memory. But notice that on the back end of that, there's this really extensive passage about what it felt like to be Joseph and what it seemed like, and how both then and since he has often thought, right? That's interpretive memory. You can't have interpretive memory at the time or shortly after the time of the experience. Interpretive memory develops over a long period of time from subsequent experience and reflection. And a major reason why that account in the Pearl of Great Price has some of its characteristic features is because Joseph is writing it after the worst year of his life. And so it's defiant, and it uses the word persecution over and over. Hot persecution, bitterest persecution. And it's characterized by this reflective, interpretive memory. It felt like I was Paul before Agrippa. I wondered why they wanted to make me deny what I'd actually seen. All that is Joseph feeling what it's like in 1838 to reflect on the vision. And then 1842 account is what we call the Wentworth letter. And that one you can see that it's written to do some PR work, right? Joseph is approached by this very influential editor saying, why don't you tell your own story? And so Joseph writes, and instead of saying, in this context, I learned from God that the professors of Christianity were corrupt and their creeds were an abomination, he says, the Lord told me that the other churches were believing in incorrect doctrines. So, same message, but packaged for different. We could go on and on, but maybe that's enough. I do want to let folks know that I have thought a lot about the first vision accounts, and I'm happy to engage on and on about that, ad nauseum, I'm sure, for many folks. But I didn't want to appear to be dodging that important question.
No, that's wonderful. Yeah, I know that there's the whole concept. How I understand it is a simple mind that I have. Is there would be some type of evolution of understanding, how he's adapting his message over time, inventing the two personages, that sort of thing. And to me, that sort of makes sense. But my question is, why would he fly in the face of all the other Christians around him by saying that there's two separate, people? That kind of doesn't make sense to me. Just thinking about it.
Me either. I don't find any consciousness, any evidence of consciousness in changing the first vision accounts over time. In other words, there are differences in them. They are differences that are accounted for by unconscious acts. Joseph's not scheming to elaborate his story or embellish it. He is remembering in the present, and we always remember one psychologist of memory, Dan Schachter at Harvard, says remembering is like seeing with your two eyes, right? And his analogy is you have to see in the past and in the present. A memory makes no sense unless it's for the present. I don't want to get too deep into this, but lots and lots of scholars are saying today, and I believe them, that a memory is not something you make and then store and then retrieve in a present, a later present. It's something you make. You compose it in the present out of pieces that are available that you accumulated throughout the past. Sometime I might write an essay about this and make the analogy that's a little bit like my son's set of Legos. He got one of these sets of Legos that come in a box, like 350 pieces, and you could make a specific object. You could follow the pattern on the box and make the spaceship or whatever it was. But you could also take it apart and make a variation on that. You could make 15 variations on that spaceship. And that's a lot the way memory works. There's a limited number of variations you could do, but there's also quite a lot of potential for variation in the pieces out of which you can compose a memory.
Great. I'm just reading here. There's a couple questions coming in. Just to verify, Sidney Rigdon, the 1838 version, did he have any say in it?
It's difficult. It's really impossible to know for sure.
Okay.
We do know that George Robinson and Sidney Rigdon helped Joseph do that one. But discerning exactly what Rigdon fingerprints there may be on it is impossible to know, because one reason is because we do not have the original draft of it anymore. We only have an 1839 copy. It's not even possible to know for sure what was written in 1838 compared to what's written in 1839.
Okay, very good. So I have another question here. It's about the first vision, and he is asking about, let's see, I've decided to do some source analysis with some people for career night, so for the young women, and decided to use the 1835 account and the 1838-39 account of the first vision. He doesn't have much time to go into a lot of complexity, but what elements would you draw out of to show them how historians do how you do your work on those accounts, and then introduce them to the accounts in an interesting and faith-promoting way? So any advice there on how to teach those, I guess, the difference between the two accounts or the different accounts?
Yeah, I just gave a paper at an academic conference that compared those two accounts. And I used some of the memory studies I just talked about. But if I were going to do that with the young women, that'd be daunting. Is that what this person said?
Yeah. Yeah.
Good luck. I'll pray for you. So I think that's a worthy goal, but I would keep it very simple. One of the things that both of those, the fundamental difference between those two accounts is that one of them, the 35, is a spontaneous memory. And I believe that one of the effects of that is it's not about persecution. Joseph's not reacting to the Methodist minister. It just tells the story without the defensiveness. And so it's quite fresh in that regard. The 38-39 account is responding to the Methodist minister. Joseph sees him as the beginning of persecution. As he searches his past for the origin of the persecution that just landed him in that stinking dungeon cell in Liberty for the last 6 months, he finds it in that Methodist minister who landed on him so hard just a few days after the vision. So the 3839 is a strategic retrieval of memory. It's an intentional autobiography, and as Joseph searches his mind for the origins of his persecuted life, he goes back to the vision and the response to it. So that's absent from the 35 spontaneous memory. I would not try teaching that to young women. Instead, what I would emphasize to them is that God answers the prayers of anxious teenagers. I would show them the 35 account and have them pull out of it all of the anxious words. Joseph says he's perplexed, distressed, right? And the 3839, he says he has great anxiety. These are the things that teenagers need to see. And they need to know that you can go to the scriptures and find answers, and especially that you can go to God in prayer. They need to know that James 1:5 is true. That's their theme for the year anyway. And notice how Joseph wraps up the story. Here's an interesting contrast. When you listen to people in Sunday school lessons teach the first vision, have you noticed how often they say the real takeaway here is that we're not Trinitarians? And notice that that doesn't even enter into Joseph's story. That's an overlay we've put on it. But notice what his takeaway lesson is. I had found the testimony of James to be true, that anybody who lacked wisdom could ask of God and be answered. So if I were going to try to talk to youth about it, those are the points I would emphasize. That they're not the first anxious, stressed out, worried teenager, and that God has a long history of answering the ones who ask him in faith.
Very good. Great question. And then the other take on this, and how much time do you have, Dr. Harper? Do you have any more time? Are you all ready to go?
No, whatever you do, Leo. I'll try to be a little more terse.
It's okay. This is wonderful. Well, maybe we'll invite you back next year and we can do it again.
Whatever seems best.
The other question I think is a good one. It's about investigators and people that are maybe studying, the church for the first time and run into this information. Our missionaries, of course, share the main account, Pearl of Great Price. And anything that you think that they should do or we should do differently to help our investigating friends?
Yeah, we sometimes miss the point of Joseph's quest for the true church, right? Which he emphasizes in the 3839 account. But when we read all the accounts, we understand why he's on a quest for the true church. The true church is meaningless unless it brings redemption, right? The reason for finding Christ's church is to find redemption through Jesus Christ. And Joseph emphasizes in the earliest account that what he's after is forgiveness. He's convicted of his sins. He needs forgiveness. That's the only reason to search for the true church. And what members of the church and investigators of the church need is redemption, forgiveness through Christ. And so to help them, to help any of us understand the vision fully, we need to hear Joseph making that plea, that petition. And you can hear it a little better in the earlier accounts than the one that's just in the Pearl of Great Price. When we put those with the one in the Pearl of Great Price, then it's perfectly adequate to help us understand why he's looking for the true church.
Yeah. And something else to add to that, is when I've had missionaries in our area here, I'm in Dallas, and we've taught some investigators here together, and I go out with them, and of course they'll have questions about things, but sometimes missionaries don't even know, bless their hearts, about the different versions, right?
Right.
Some of them don't, and that's okay. I think more over time, I think that missionaries, at a young age, will be able to know about some of these things and be able to speak competently about them. But whenever I'm out with the missionaries, I like to, help to supplement the information a little bit there and answer those questions. And maybe, hey, so if you ever see this online, this is what that might mean. Point them to Dr. Harper so they can understand it better. But that's just my 2 cents there. So other questions that we have from anybody else in the group, please go ahead. I'll just look through here and see if, was there any other ones, Dr. Harper, that you thought you wanted to touch on that you remember in the list?
There were a bunch that are certainly worthy. They're all worthy, but some of them I'm not qualified to answer.
Mm-hmm.
So any that are on the list there, or any that are hot right now, I'd be glad to try to handle. Or
I think one more that I think would be helpful is about priesthood power. In the church sometimes we get caught up on, do I have enough faith, or am I worthy enough to provide a priesthood blessing? How do we deal with all the different variables? Faith, worthiness, God's will. How do we justify a situation in our minds and our hearts doesn't turn out the way we would hope, that we've blessed a child with faith and they don't get healed? Priesthood power is one that I think can be troubling for some.
Yeah, it certainly can. This is a beautiful question and a challenging one. So I have these same feelings, had desires to bless my own family in times of need and to receive blessings and so on. And I don't know anybody who gives priesthood blessings that doesn't wonder, well, am I worthy to do this, and so forth. So the best thing I have ever heard on this is Elder Oaks' talk a few years ago about giving priesthood blessings. It's fantastic. I can't remember who he quotes or paraphrases in that talk, but it was essentially to the effect that you do the best you can and you leave it with God. In other words, you may feel like blessing somebody with that they'll be healed, and you may say that, and then they may not be healed. And that we need not necessarily interpret that as a failure on our part. We bless people with what we feel like we should and hope that God will give them, and then we leave it with God. And the blessing may or may not come in the way that we hope. So I guess for my own purposes, I took a lot of comfort in that talk. It relieved a lot of pressure for me. I don't feel like I have to be perfect in giving priesthood blessings. When I give them, I try to be as good as I can. I try to prepare. I say what I think the Lord wants me to say, but I recognize that I'm bringing a lot of humanness to it, and so I trust Him to fix any defects and to ultimately accomplish His will. And I guess it's a Lutheran way of thinking of it in a sense. By that I mean that the liberation comes from acknowledging how weak and incapable you are, and the same breath trusting in God, and God will always come through for us.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I'm not sure if my friend asked that question is on the group tonight, but I'll make sure he sees that part of the video.
If I remember right, Leo, the question said something like, how do you know priesthood is real? And I thought a lot about this one, actually. I mean, I've thought a lot about it for 40 years or whatever it is. It's a beautiful question, and one that I can't answer adequately in a few minutes, but for my own life, I'm a pragmatist, philosophically speaking. That is, if it works for me, I believe in it. And priesthood works for me. And what I especially mean by that is that passage in D&C 121, 34 to 46, those are words to live by. And I am far from measuring up to those words, but having them in my consciousness, right? We ought to all memorize them. And having them there is very edifying. It's my ideal. It's what I should live up to. And just trying to makes me a much better father, husband, than the natural man in me would otherwise be. And that's priesthood power, right? For me, priesthood power has less to do with me being able to heal my children when they're sick and more to do with me becoming more like my Heavenly Father. The desire to bless my children is priesthood.
Yeah, well said. A couple other questions here, and then we can. I know that I remember taking D&C from you at BYU, and you had a little segment on the policy change 78, the priesthood ban, and I remember you telling an experience about feeling that it was a real revelation. You were there, I think, at the tabernacle or something. I can't remember all the details, but maybe just share that quickly, your testimony about the policy change and that it was revelatory.
Oh, yeah, no doubt it was revelatory. No doubt in my mind. So I was 8 years old that summer. At my house in June, when the priesthood revelation was announced, it was a big deal at the dinner table. But I really had no concept for it. I didn't have the scaffolding on which to hang it to give it any meaning. So it went right along with Elvis Presley's death and other monumental events in that same window of time that all seemed like the same significance. I remember when Elvis Presley died, I thought that was like the prophet or something. That was my confused state of mind. So I'm saying that to tell you that I really didn't understand how monumental it was. But that September, I went to conference. The last day of September was actually the first day of October conference in 1978. And I was 8 years old, and my father, I went to the session with my father where President Tanner, if I recall correctly, did the sustaining, and among other things, he read the revelation and asked for a sustaining vote. And I raised my hand with everybody else without really knowing what was going on. But what I do remember best from that experience is that my dad took me to a place outside the tabernacle and said, I want you to come here at a specified time. I don't remember what time it was, but it was just before the afternoon session was to end. So I went there, and some ushers came out and roped off a little section. And after the session ended, President Kimball came out that door, went around the rope, and shook hands with the children. There were children like me lined up all around the rope. And the other thing I remember very vividly is that morning session, when President Kimball walked into the tabernacle, the congregation rose spontaneously and began to sing, "We thank thee, O God, for a prophet." And I now understand that was in response to the revelation. It was a way of the saints thanking God for that revelation and the prophet who received it. I didn't understand any of that stuff at the time, but I will tell you that the Spirit of God that filled the tabernacle when the saints rose and began to sing that song is undeniable to me. And because I remember that witness and now understand what had happened, the revelation, I recognize that that's my way of witnessing, of testifying that God does have prophets and that President Kimball received a revelation. I do not know what the cause or causes of the priesthood ban are. Some people are absolutely certain that God forbade giving priesthood to blacks. I am not. Some people are absolutely certain that Brigham Young was, it's best explained by Brigham Young being racist and invoking this policy. I can see reasons why you would make that conclusion, but I'm not absolutely certain that that's all there is to it. So I don't know why there was a ban exactly, but I do know that there was a revelation that reversed it, and that came in June of 1978.
Wonderful. Well said. Thank you so much. I don't know if there are any other questions here in the chat. I know that we're over the hour here, and it's been wonderful so far. I've got the questions, the list here. Maybe we can connect afterwards, and if you have any other notes on anything that's in here, then I can pass that along to everybody in the group. But we have, the group is growing on Facebook. We have over 400 members now, and it's growing quite a bit every week. We had 90 people last week join, and it's going to be, I think it's just important for us to be open about questions. As you can see here with Dr. Harper, he's open. He's willing to talk about these things, and he knows the history, and he has faith. And I just think that's an amazing testimony for us to know that there are people that understand these issues and have wrestled with them and still believe with all their hearts. And that's what faith is all about. And I think it's an amazing, witness for me and for all of us. So really appreciate you. Any other final words of wisdom before we wrap up?
No, I'd be happy to respond to other questions, even one-on-one if folks want to email questions, or I'll send you my notes on that list or whatever. I'm happy to do that. I know I've been long-winded here tonight, but I'm grateful to everybody out there who would listen at all to what I have to say, and I'm really grateful to you, Leo, for this ministry you're doing.
Thank you, Brother Harper. Well, we all love you very much and love everybody here. My friend Delane is here in the background. He's been listening in. He's here with me in Dallas. But we'll do this again. At the beginning of the year, we've got another event planned. And if you have time, Dr. Harper will invite you back, and we can talk about something else that's...
Glad to, Leo.
So thank you very much, and we can end the conversation.
All right,
good night,
thank you, everybody.